Great. Okay, so welcome to another conversation. My name is Aneta Idczak, and I'm a yoga teacher, trauma-informed yoga and embodied resilience teacher and trainer. I'm a founder of Golden Mandala Yoga School, Golden Mandala Yoga Summer Institute now called. And today I have got a really great guest. We have with us Fiona Agombar. Am I pronouncing? Hope I'm pronouncing it right. Yeah, great. So welcome, Fiona. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Aneta. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's just lovely to get to know you better as well. So thank you.
Thank you. And I wanted to start today. Some people might know you. I know that you wrote a really great book around burnout and looking at chronic fatigue syndrome and stuff like that. And so some people might know you already, but I think it would be really great for you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, thank you. So I'm a yoga teacher and a yoga therapist in the Krishnamacharya tradition. And going back about 30 years now, I used to run a very busy public relations business. And so this was, I'm just thinking, it was the late 1980s. And by 1990, I had what we would now call burnout, but it wasn't really a word that was used then. And I got an infection. So it was kind of like a flu-like infection. And basically I didn't recover. And later on, blood tests showed that I'd had glandular fever. And I was told by my doctor to just go and take exercise. I wasn't given the correct instructions, which should have been to rest. And from this, I developed ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. And in those days, it was not really acknowledged or understood. And in fact, quite a lot of the press and some of the medical profession were quite rude about us. They called us things like malingerers. Some of the culture actually, which is happening to some people with long COVID now, although I think actually things are a lot better for those with long COVID, but I do know that some people are having difficulty also getting treatment and acceptance. So, I mean, this went on for a number of years. At one point, I was so ill, I was in a wheelchair. I was desperately ill. I was what would now be classed as severely ill. I was hospitalized for 3 months. But after about 5 years of this, I bumped into a yoga teacher where I lived when I was well enough to go into my local village. And she said, I know a few people who've got this same kind of mysterious illness that you've got. And yoga is all about prana and moving energy. I'm going to set up a special class. She called it a remedial class. Would you like to come and join in? So I think there were 4 of us, and we did it at her house. Her name was Angela Stevens. She was wonderful. And I immediately started to feel something shift in me. I can't say that I immediately got better, because that would not be true, but I made this connection with my body, which of course in trauma we all know about. So it was like coming home, that sense of arriving back in my body, where probably I'd been detached from my body for years and years. And so I carried on doing yoga, practicing yoga. And then I started visiting somewhere called the Yoga for Health Foundation, which was this incredible yoga centre, which sadly is no longer open, in Bedfordshire. So I'd go off for weeks, for a week's course, and that would make a huge improvement. And I got so much better from yoga, particularly learning about breathing. I consequently wrote my first book, which was called Beat Fatigue with Yoga. So I wrote that actually before I qualified as a teacher. And then I made a full recovery. And part of my recovery, I mean, I can't say it's to do with my relationship, because this is so there's so many things which come into play. But part of my recovery, I think, was actually leaving quite a toxic marriage, and lots of other things. I managed to come off all the medication I'd been put on. And then I consequently did further training in yoga as a yoga teacher. And I set up retreats. And because of the book I'd written, Beat Fatigue with Yoga, lots and lots of people with ME came and joined me. So I kind of, my work for about 7 or 8 years was working primarily with people with fatigue, chronic fatigue, ME. And consequently, I then designed some teacher training courses, which I did with Yoga Campus. And then in 2011, I got bitten by a tick and I developed chronic fatigue syndrome again myself. So this was kind of like another big lesson, because I think when we get ill, these are all lessons for us to look at. And around this time, I also was learning about trauma. And I had had trauma within my first marriage. My husband had been violent, but that's also because he had his own trauma. You know, historically, you couldn't, I can see all the dots joining up. Anyway, long story short, I've then written another book, Yoga Therapy for Stress, Burnout and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, which took me 8 years of research to write. And in that, I really did kind of dive deeply into trauma, because I was looking at it for my own self. But, you know, as teachers, if we're talking about chronic fatigue, trauma, I think, needs to be part of the conversation. It might not be the only factor, but it is one of the factors that needs to be addressed. So I'm now living in Spain and I'm teaching for fatigue twice a week on Zoom. And I'm also now working, you know, sadly, with people with long COVID as well.
Yeah.
So I hope that wasn't too long, and I apologize if it was.
No, that's great. It's a really interesting story. And I think there is so much richness in it. And as you just said, you know, those challenges that we experience with through illness, through relationships, through really noticing what's happening to us, acknowledging it, witnessing it with compassion, and then making changes. They are the biggest learning. And what I love about your story so much is that, you know, your own story really led you into the work that you do, that comes from really your soul, from your own experiences, from supporting other people. And it's like, people often talk about find your niche, and, you know, the best kind of niche or the best kind of way of working is that finds you. You don't find it, you are guided to it, and somehow it becomes you know, the core of what you are passionate about, the core of what you understand, and how you can share it with others. So I really love that. And I guess it's what you just said here, you know, those different things: burnout, chronic fatigue, trauma, and now long COVID. All of them are so connected. And so, you know, for many of us right now, they are the reality. I mean, we're not talking so much, you know, here in UK and also in Europe, you know, it almost feels like we stopped talking about COVID a little bit. It kind of, you know, we out of this very intense period of lockdowns, very intense period of, you know, lots of talking about a lot of infections and a lot of deaths. But it's still happening in the background, isn't it? And what it leaves people with is this long COVID situation that I know that you do a lot of work with. And I wonder, maybe you could talk a little bit about it, your experience of working with people experiencing long COVID at the moment.
Well, like you say, to an extent, we have moved on from COVID. And while I think that's good, and I think there are reasons, you know, because there was a time when we were just being sent messages of fear the whole time by the media. I don't think that's good for any of us. We are left with this very, very sad legacy of long COVID. And in the UK, the latest figures from the National Office of Statistics show that 1.5 million people are referring themselves as having, or acknowledging that they have long COVID. And the figures for people who've had the symptoms of long COVID for more than a year, something like, I think it's 685,000. So we're talking about really high figures.
Yeah.
And you know, it's really sad that this is the legacy. So for me, how I started working with long COVID was because just to kind of finish my story, is I stopped teaching for 5 years because I was nursing my second husband, who was very, very ill with cancer. And then he died at the end of 2019. And I was going to come back to Spain then, but then lockdown happened. And I then kind of, like everybody, was, locked in, stuck in my house. And then a lot of yoga teachers are saying, oh, we're teaching online. So I thought, well, maybe I should give that a go. So I started teaching on Zoom. And because we teach what we know, as you were just saying, we do what we do from the soul. It's called our Dharma. So I wanted to teach people with fatigue because I knew that people with ME might be frightened and alone or isolated. And I know what it is to have chronic fatigue. So I started just putting out that if you had fatigue or burnout, I would be doing specific classes on Zoom. And then very quickly, within a couple of months, people were coming to me saying, I've had COVID and I'm not recovering. So this is even in April and May of 2020. So it was clear even then that something was happening. And then, as we were going along, we were then learning more about long COVID. And I think when we talk about ME, chronic fatigue, or long COVID, we are looking at a post-viral fatigue situation. So if you look at the symptoms of long COVID, the number one symptom, sadly, is fatigue. So that is what I am trying to address in my own teaching. But then there are other symptoms also, like many people have got breathing difficulties, many people have got heart problems, cardiomyopathy. They have things like MCAS, which is mast cell activation syndrome, which is actually something I have myself from Lyme. We haven't got time to go into this, but what I'm saying is that long COVID, like ME, has a whole subset of problems and symptoms, which are very difficult for people to deal with. But the other thing I notice with people with long COVID is that many of them are traumatized. So that either traumatized because they've had a really bad experience in hospital. I've actually got quite a close friend of mine who nearly died, and she was about to be ventilated. They didn't ventilate her in the end, but she still has got the trauma of that. And she is terrified of reinfection, which is quite common in people who've been very ill the first time. They become very anxious about being reinfected. And then, you have other people who've had long COVID who are traumatized just because, I like the mask situation. You may or may not agree with masks, but people who've been very ill get very traumatized if they see people walking around without masks. So because it's been a trauma for them, it sets off their nervous system. Their nervous system is dysregulated, so they become quite anxious and panicky about that. So we need, whatever our feelings are on COVID, on the politics of it, on vaccination, on masks, we need endless compassion, because we need to realize that people are still very, very highly aroused or shut down from this. And this is, whatever kind of teaching we're doing, this is the kind of thing we might be dealing with in our classes.
Yeah.
So does that answer?
Yeah, no, this is, what you just said is so important. It's not just, the long COVID, it's the, and the physical stuff, although it is really, really difficult, shortness of breath, the fatigue, but also how it impacts the whole of your life. It's your relationships, your work, how you show up, whether you even feel that you can go and be around other people, or whether that fear of being reinfected stops you from actually living your life. And there might be other things that come up. If, when you're so ill and you are in that state of shutdown, there is depression. There is a sense of hopelessness that might be even leading to feeling like you want to end it all because it all becomes too much. I know that the suicide rates are very high at the moment here in UK. So, there is the whole range of things that come with it. And I think, many experts are talking about mental health crisis. and the crisis of that we're going to be seeing it for many years to come. And I think we're not at the end of it yet, are we? And
well, I was going to say, sadly, I think we're actually just at the beginning.
yeah.
And I think, you know, that yoga has got a huge role to play with this.
Yes.
Whereas, you know, we can step in where maybe the NHS doesn't have the tools that we have. But I mean, just to build on what you're saying about people with long COVID, people I work with ME got very similar symptoms, but many of them have come to terms with the fact, and they've learned to manage and pace. And they, you know, they have learned maybe over a period of a few years to accept what's happening. But for many, having ME itself is traumatic, because your life, you know, you have all these losses. You have, maybe you lose your relationship, you lose your job, you might have to move. Your life is not what it was. And it's now the same for people with long COVID, is that, you know, there is trauma in them facing the loss of their life as they knew it and what the life is now. And certainly in yoga, we can maybe very gently guide people that, well, maybe life is different, but maybe it ultimately might be better that because we're all rushing around, we're living such a fast-paced life in the West, that maybe we do need to readdress our priorities. But nonetheless, for people with long COVID to have all these losses, to not be able to have the energy to go out, is very traumatic. And also, when I've been preparing for this teacher training course, which you're going to come and have you know, you're very kindly, I'm interviewing you on that. When I've been going through my notes, I've kind of made this realization that when we're talking about the importance of social connection for our welfare, people with ME very often are not well enough to go out and make social connection. It's the same with long COVID. If you have not got the energy, you've got chronic fatigue, and you can hardly get out of bed or even cook a meal, let alone shop. You know, the idea of going out and having even a 10-minute conversation with someone might be completely exhausting. So therefore, you're not having that extra social connection that you need to help you to self-soothe and to bring you back to homeostasis. So, you know, there's a lot of problems when we look at the whole kind of spectrum of chronic fatigue. So that's where I think, you know, as yoga teachers, we need a very specific approach.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And it's, you know, in a sense, a lot of yoga teachers say, I don't like really working online. I can't wait to go in person. And in person, teaching in person is amazing, absolutely wonderful. But for somebody, as you just said, who's not able to really go out and socialize, not able to get to that class, having sessions online can be life-saving thing, because it's that kind of, we need to connect with others. When we stay alone, it's much more likely that we go into downward spiral, because we are left with all those feelings and all those thoughts and feeling like nobody cares, like nothing that we do, or we can't do anything, or nothing that we do makes any difference. We need that social connection with others, from other people, just to say, it's okay how you feel, it's fine. And, you know, giving people, from a very practical point of view of yoga, you know, do what you can. Let's explore what you can here. You know, I know from my own practice, I don't every single day do downwards facing dog. Sometimes my body just like says, no, I just want to lie on the floor, do some gentle somatic movement, do some breathing, check in with myself, notice how I am. You know, because I've got not that much energy, because I'm tired, I've been busy, or I'm in my menstrual cycle, especially now going through perimenopause, that every so often is kicking my ass really badly. And, you know, managing that is really important. And these are the tools that we can share with our students to really normalize that yoga doesn't look in just one way, that you can do yoga and practice yoga however you feel. It can be just being with your breath, or it can be just doing some gentle movement, or it can be just lying down and feeling the support of the ground, that stability and the safety in the present moment. And that can help you feel better and regulate your nervous system. There's so much of it in here that, you know, we need to explore as yoga teachers. And that's why it's so great to for trainings like yours to explore that and really unpack it. What is really happening here when you are in burnout, when you've had some kind of viral infection like COVID, and then it leads to long-term impact on the body. So I wanted to ask a question. If there was one thing that you could say, I know that we could stay here and talk for a really long time because it's such a big subject, but if there was one thing that you feel is one of the most important things for yoga teachers to know currently, to take into account, long COVID and people with maybe living with fatigue and maybe experience trauma. So what would that thing be?
It's difficult just to reduce it down to
one. I know.
It would be to not think of yoga as being asana based, because I think in the West, we've taken yoga, there's been a little bit of cultural misappropriation and we make everything about movement, but yoga is about so much. And when we're talking about chronic fatigue, burnout, long COVID, there are so many tools there which can really help to nourish someone. So we want to be focusing more on healthy breathing, relaxation, deep rest, convalescence. We can use things like mudra and nyasa, which means hand placement, mantra maybe. There's all these amazing tools. And then teaching people to pace, because we come from a very fast-paced society, which is why we're all burning out. So we want to help our students to learn to rest between any activity, so that can then be an attitude they take off the mat. So I would say if you're working with people with fatigue or long COVID, please take yourself away from the idea of asana and movement and look more at the other tools that yoga has to offer. There's a wonderful quote from TKV Desikachar, which is often used from the Heart of Yoga. And he says, if you can breathe, you can do yoga. And we need to remember that, because actually one of the definition of yoga by Patanjali is that yoga is about the mind becoming quiet. It's also about helping prana to move around the body. And there are all kinds of ways we can do that. It doesn't just have to be asana. If we're dealing with people who are really, really fatigued, we've got to get away from thinking yoga has to be about movement. And actually, you mentioned on Zoom, that gives people access. That's been the most amazing thing really for my classes, because I've got people who were not well enough to come on my retreats. And sometimes they work from a bed or they're lying on a sofa, but yoga on Zoom has given them access. And then what I've done is try to build a community on Facebook, so that there is this feeling of connection at least. But when I started teaching on Zoom in April 2020, I got a lot of feedback saying, please don't do standing postures. So now I just do floor work and occasional work from sitting. So that's something I've learned from my students to, even though I thought I'd taught incredibly gently, was to dial it down even further. So that's my big message. Really, really gentle, not too much movement.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that, because when we shifted, 2 years ago into online work, and I took all my classes online as well. And that's the first thing that I learned, that you had to slow it down because it was online. It had to be, and everybody was just so tired and quite anxious, and there was so much uncertainty. We needed to slow down loads more to allow ourselves to arrive. I noticed it was taking people much longer to arrive in the body, to arrive in the class, to shift from that mind level and this hyperactivation of being on the alert into going in, or coming out of shutdown and actually being more present in the body rather than hiding somewhere deep within and being in that frozen state. It does take a long time. And I love what you just said, that we all live in such fast pace. And for myself, I've been noticing that as we came out of the lockdowns, I've heard a lot of yoga teachers saying, I'm not going to do what I was doing before. And somehow all of it rolling in. And I find that in the last 3 months, I've let go of a lot of things because it felt like everything was beginning to speed up again. And I just couldn't cope with it. I was becoming really overwhelmed and thinking, well, I cannot go back to the same speed. I need to slow it down, and I need to just focus on few things that I love doing and that, you know, that are supportive for my students or my clients or other yoga teachers, and just not do a lot of other stuff where I'm all over the place, you know, doing this project and that project and working on this and doing that, and kind of ending up at the end of the day being completely frazzled and completely exhausted. Because just like you, I have experienced burnout. You know, in the past, I've watched my partner going through burnout, and it's always there. Even this week, I bumped into somebody that I used to work in social care. So like 8 or 9 years ago, I think, we were working from the same center, you know, and he was telling me about, and he's a trained counselor and high intensity practitioner working with CBD and other approaches. And he was telling me how, you know, he crashed, and it was not only burnout, but also a complete breakdown, and to the point that he was hospitalized for quite a few months and then recovering from that. And so that burnout in yoga teachers or frontline workers is so common. You know, and if we are not careful, we might miss or try not to notice the early warning signs that then lead. And then obviously there is the other stuff. If your health goes, you know, with COVID, for example, the impact of it is really, really profound. And then there is another thing, you know, when we go back to trauma, you mentioned that, you know, if something like this happens for the COVID, on top of the last 2 years of uncertainty and current uncertainty, and you already have experienced trauma in your childhood, let's say, that's just yet another thing on top of your experience that is already getting quite overwhelmed and it's already struggling, already being triggered, you know, being on a very high alert continuously for long periods of time, or going into freeze and shutdown, or alternating between the two, which is kind of a classical burnout cycle, isn't it? Yeah. So I wonder, you know, if you have got some thoughts around that moving forward, you know, around burnout and yoga teachers specifically.
Sadly, yoga teachers are get burnt out too, as you just said. I actually, a few months ago, I just to support people, because I kept coming across yoga teachers with chronic fatigue, I set up a Facebook group, and it was just called Yoga Teachers with Fatigue Support. And I thought, you know, I might get 20 or 30, but I think we've got about 140 teachers on there. But I just invited you. I don't know if you've managed to have a look at it.
Thank you. I will have a look later.
But this is the 140 yoga teachers who've got some kind of chronic fatigue or burnout.
Yeah.
So on that group, there is a lot of talk about self-care and, you know, the old cliche, needing to put on our oxygen masks first before we can help others, because obviously we have to understand burnout for ourselves. We have to look after ourselves before we're looking after others. But I see the whole, I mean, you were just talking about lockdown and the whole, the last 2 years of the pandemic. I think it can go either way. It's either an opportunity for growth and for us to take stock and do self-inquiry and see how we want our lives to be going forward, or we fall back into the trauma and we listen to all those fear messages which are being pumped out all the time. I mean, it was quite interesting. I've got another yoga group which is called Restful Yoga for Fatigue, and I asked the question again. I tagged you, Aneta. Have you found the pandemic traumatic? And it was about half and half. So a lot of people with long COVID were saying, yes, it was extremely traumatic. I was very triggered. Other people with ME were saying, well, no, actually, it was more of what I was used to, but it gave me a chance to be quiet and to reflect on how I want to move going forward. So I think, this time we have to see, hopefully, as an opportunity, how do we want our lives to be? Do we want to be continually racing and pushing and striving and chasing, which is how our society is? And I think because we have such huge mental health problems now, we have to think about looking after our own mental health and what we input. So, for example, for me, like I advise my students, and I think you do too, don't watch the news because it's fearful and it's going to hyper arouse you. The problem is it's also addictive because it sets off dopamine and other chemicals, including adrenaline. So it can be addictive to keep watching, but realize the addiction and try to not go there. And that doesn't mean that you don't know what's going on, because I think we always find out what's going on somehow. Obviously, we need to restrict social media as much as we can. And we just need to be really cautious about what we input. If we're watching television, fine, but what are we watching? Yeah. I personally can't watch any horror films or anything that's going to set my adrenaline off. Like a thriller, I actually can't deal with it at the moment. So I'm just really cautious about who I expose myself to socially and what I input, so that I'm doing my best to keep my energy up and myself positive and keep my vibration high. Yeah. So we really do need to be mindful about how we're living and how we move forward. So, maybe the pandemic is an opportunity for that. Let's hope so.
Yeah. I love what you just said. It's exactly that. It's about knowing, it all starts with knowing ourselves and really noticing and acknowledging how we are responding to different things. I know for me is that there is an element that I do watch the news, and being Polish and having my whole family in Poland, I do need to know what's happening. Because that's really important for me. I need to kind of be able to respond if the situation gets much more challenging. And speaking with my parents, I always know what's happening because we speak every few days. But definitely limiting it is, I used to look quite often on my phone on the news, and I don't look a lot because I either get really angry or I get upset, or I get very anxious. My nervous system gets triggered. And I agree, it is an opportunity to really decide how you want to live your life and really decide. But I think with that often comes another challenge, that we don't have the set of skills to do that. We don't know how to do it. So when I think about, for example, the way that most yoga teachers teach, with lots of classes running from one studio to another, from one venue to another, trying to get as many people as they can into the yoga classes. And, I've been teaching for 12 years. It's okay when you are younger. Now that I'm almost 50, there is no way that I could do that. So really understanding that maybe we can change how we work, and maybe we need to learn different set of skills, not just another approach like restorative or yin or all those different approaches, but really how to work in a different way that is supportive for us, that is sustainable long term. Because as you just said, that long COVID and burnout is so prevalent, and it can impact us. I know so many people currently that are ill, people that I know personally. Like, I was going to go for a hairdressing appointment and my hairdresser cancelled because her and her husband are ill. It's all around us, and it is still there impacting us on a daily basis. So we do need to learn how to work in a slightly different way. Definitely.
I think we need to slow down. We need to convalesce. Yes. We need to rest. We need to really think about what stresses us and how we can deal with it. We need to have tools for that. Yeah. But, above all, as a society, we need to slow down and we need to take care of ourselves when we're ill and not rush back to work. And I believe one of the reasons we're seeing such prevalence of long COVID, as we did with ME, is because people are not convalescing properly.
Yeah.
You know, and this is part of the message of, I hope that we learn if we go forward with a new world, you know, that we're not always chasing and running after stuff, that we're growing our own vegetables, we're cooking from scratch, we're doing things more slowly, more mindfully.
Yeah. So I wonder,
prioritizing.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, are you seeing that change from your work with other people? Are you seeing us slowing down, or are you seeing that maybe that some of us are slowing down and others are back into this fast pace?
What I'm seeing, and I am generalizing, is that people who've had ME for a few years are like that anyway. So they have often been through a great pain barrier of a few years of coming to terms with being ill. But once they have accepted it, they will be prioritizing more, being in nature, you know, looking at a flower, hugging a tree, having a pet, whatever, that becomes much more important. The people with long COVID may be moving towards that, but are struggling with that. But I always think that illness is an opportunity to wake us up, because it gives us the time, if we want to be still, quiet, to go inside, to maybe do meditation, to self-inquire, to maybe stop and say, what is life actually about? Is there meaning and purpose here? Maybe even there's a spiritual meaning, which when we're rushing around, we don't have time to see. So yes, I am seeing that with some people when they're ready. You know, it has to be in our own time.
Yeah, I love it that you just said, you know, going in nature and having pets and stuff like that, because we've had Oscar, our dog, for just over a year, and it completely changed our lives. It's like we were going for walks before, but only really on weekends, whereas now I have to get out 3 times a day.
Yeah, it makes you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying I have to, but I love it. It's kind of, I know I've got my routine going in the morning, going lunchtime, and going at the end of the day, which also means that when I finish work and then go out with Oscar, I come back and I don't do any more work. Whereas in the past, it used to kind of spill over a little bit. So
that's so lovely. And of course, as we know, pets help us to self-regulate. So,
yes.
I mean, I know you don't live on your own, but if you do live on your own, getting a pet is a really good answer for co-regulation.
Yes.
I mean, I had, when I was, my second husband, before he died, we had a dog. Sadly, our dog Abby died 6 weeks before he did. But she was just like the light of my life. I don't think I could have got through nursing him without her. So, you know, animals are just the most incredible way to open your heart. Yeah. And if we're talking about in terms of trauma, you know, they're helping us to co-regulate too. But let's not boil it down just to science. Let's also look at the beauty and love of having a pet.
Yeah,
it's
completely.
You know, something that's very special.
Yeah, completely. Okay, thank you, Fiona, so much for taking time to speak with me. And what I would love you to do is to just say a few words about your upcoming course and about how people can find you. So not just the training course for yoga teachers, but also for people who maybe are struggling with long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome. If you could share how people can find you and a few details, that would be great.
Okay, thank you, Aneta. So on Facebook, I'm on Restful Yoga for Fatigue with Fiona. And I mentioned there's also for yoga teachers with fatigue support, if you're a yoga teacher and you wanted to join us there. I've written a book, which is Yoga Therapy for Stress, Burnout and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, which is published by Singing Dragon. And then the training I'm doing the training with Sarah Ryan, who used to be my teacher, and she's amazing. It's actually part 2 of the training on stress, burnout and long COVID, and it starts at the end of April. You need to have done part 1 first, but part 1 is available as a recorded course. It's just 6 hours. And then so part 2 will start live, and then Netta is coming in to be interviewed with session 3 of that. But all the details of this are through Yoga Teachers Forum. So hop onto Yoga Teachers Forum or contact me I'm on Facebook, or I've got a website, which is my name. Yeah.
Great.
Thank
you. What I will do also is I will share those details and the link to your website and to your page, so people can find you really easily with this video.
That's very kind. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona.
Thank you.
And I'm going to, and thank you everybody for watching.
Thank you.
If you have got any questions, please comment in the group, and I will make sure tag myself or tag Fiona, and we make sure that we will answer any questions that you have. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Take care.